I'm Chris Curran. I'm an Associate Professor of Educational Leadership and Policy at the University of Florida's College of Education. I do work in the areas of school safety and discipline, and a primary focus of my work is looking at issues of equity in education. So I really think about the groups of students that have been traditionally disadvantaged by public policy and specifically by education policy historically, and focus on the ways that we can think about structuring schools and education policies to improve outcomes for those students. School resource officers, or SROs as they're commonly called, are law enforcement officers that are placed in schools as their primary beat. So these are traditionally either city police department officers, or they can be often staffed by sheriff's departments in the county level. In that case, they would be county deputies. And they're essentially full law enforcement officers. They have the full training of a law enforcement officer. They have the full arrest powers. They're typically armed with a firearm. The only difference between the SRO and a traditional police officer is that rather than policing, say, a neighborhood or a portion of the city, the SRO is placed full-time in the school as a resource to keep the school safe and to interact with students. So SRO's primary training looks a lot like a traditional law enforcement officer. They would go through a police academy and get training as any law enforcement officer would in the law and the application of the law, the use of firearms, and other law enforcement sorts of procedures. In addition to that traditional police training, SROs typically have training that's specific to being in the school. So this would be training around working with youth, training around de-escalation of situations, in some cases training about implicit bias or youth development and teenage brain development, for instance. That type of training, though, often varies considerably across locales. So we see in some places that SROs training may exist and occur with maybe a week of training or a few days in a classroom. Other agencies and districts do more extensive training. But overall, the training that a SRO gets in terms of being in the school is often considerably less than what they have in terms of being a traditional law enforcement officer. Notably, they usually have very little training necessarily in teaching. So if we think about law enforcement officers, SROs being in schools as compared to teachers, while a teacher has been in a college of education and had many years of training to think about pedagogy and instructional practices, SROs typically have little to no training in teaching practices. This is a great question. So if you go back historically, about 50 years ago, you would have seen virtually no schools with police officers present, percentages that were less than maybe 1% of schools nationally. Over the last couple decades, specifically starting in the 1990s and really progressing through the 2000s, the presence of law enforcement in schools has increased rapidly. So just between 2005 and 2015, the proportion of schools with SROs in the elementary school level has increased from about 18% to 30%. So that's almost a 2/3 increase in the presence of law enforcement among our youngest students in elementary schools. The result is that by 2015, almost half of schools nationwide have law enforcement present at least part-time during the week, and in most of these cases, they're implemented under the SRO model. So I think the reasons why SROs have been placed in schools have differed and shifted over the last couple decades. In the early years, SROs tended to be a solution to perceived problems within the school itself. So we might have seen a school that was perceived as being dangerous, as having students that were out of control, and bringing a law enforcement officer into that environment was a way to address, in many cases, what was perceived as problematic student behavior. Over the last 2 decades, though, that narrative and that motivation for putting law enforcement in schools has been shifting. So particularly since Columbine tragedy in 1999, and then through the Sandy Hook shooting, and more recently the tragedies in Parkland and Santa Fe and others, we've seen the motivation for SROs to be shifting more about external threats as opposed to internal threats. So these unfortunate incidents, these tragic incidents of school shootings have motivated many places to implement school resource officers as a response. So as I mentioned, by 2015, we've seen officers in almost half of schools nationwide. Since that time, with the existence of the Parkland shooting and the Santa Fe shooting in 2018, we've seen a number of states move to pass laws that are set to increase SRO presence even more broadly. So specifically in Florida, in the state of Maryland, we've seen laws passed that require either an SRO or some other form of law enforcement to be present or at least be proximal to every school in the state. So I think if you were to look at numbers today, you would see that probably more likely than not, more than 50% of schools and increasingly more of them have SROs or some form of law enforcement present. So I think a priority for schools is making sure that the schools are safe, and that this means protecting against external threats like a school shooting. For the law enforcement agency, there are often other motivations as well. So it's no secret that the relationships between law enforcement and the public have been strained in recent years. We've seen incidents like those in Baltimore around Freddie Gray, those in St. Louis, and so forth, that have really put a lot of tension between law enforcement and the communities they serve. So I think for law enforcement agencies, the opportunity to be in schools, to work with children, and to generally be in a position that is perceived more positively than perhaps being in the streets and making arrests is an opportunity for those law enforcement agencies to do a bit of public relations work. So we see in our research that a lot of the SROs will talk about security as their primary role, but then they'll follow that with a very secondary, a near second role, which is that of building relationships with students and increasing a positive view of law enforcement in the schools. So we see that these law enforcement agencies work hard to build relationships with students. The SROs are commonly in the classrooms, helping out with maybe coursework. They are giving high fives to students in the hallways. They're showing up to talk to students in the lunchroom. And a lot of this is built around trying to better this image and help students see law enforcement as a force for good and a positive in the community, rather than something that perhaps is around tensions with law enforcement. Even though SROs are placed in schools primarily around security focuses, the day-to-day activities of SROs take on many other roles. Obviously, the instance of a school shooting or other act of mass violence is incredibly rare. And so when SROs are interacting with students on a day-to-day basis, many of their activities are not necessarily around security themselves. So we see SROs generally trying to take on what we call the triad model. And this is a model that's put forward by the National Association of School Resource Officers. And it conceptualizes SROs' activities in three components. So the first is law enforcement. The second is acts of formal teaching, or being an educator. And then the third are acts of counseling or informal mentoring. And so we see in the research we conduct that SROs take on each of these three roles to varying degrees. They're very active in forms of law enforcement or particularly areas of security, walking around schools, making sure that exits are locked, making sure that there aren't people on campus that are not supposed to be there, checking security cameras and so forth. But then they're also very active in many cases around trying to build relationships with students, acting as counselors and mentors to students. So we observe a lot of SROs that particularly focus on students that maybe they perceive as coming from a strained background or having a hard home life, and they try to step into that role as a father or mother figure, as an adult figure that can be a positive role model in their environments. In addition to that, many of the SROs take on educator roles. This is varied and can vary based on locale and context. Many people are familiar with the traditional model of DARE, in which law enforcement officers teach traditional courses and a specific curriculum around substance abuse and so forth. Unfortunately, the evaluation evidence on DARE suggests that the program is not very effective. So we've seen some trends in recent years of officers kind of shifting away from that education component and focusing more on the relationship building and security components. I think one of the interesting things that's come out of our research is that there is a bit of a misnomer in the NASRO triad model when it comes to law enforcement. So the NASRO triad model says that law enforcement is one of the three components of a school resource officer. We find in our research that SROs actually report doing very little formal law enforcement if we're thinking about things like making arrests, issuing citations, and so forth. This is particularly true in the elementary school level when SROs are acting and interacting with very young students who more often than not are not committing crimes, or any misbehavior they're doing is not perceived as a violation of the law. And so we see in these instances that SROs are taking on a very active role in what we call or conceptualize as security. And so for some, these ideas of law enforcement and security are one and the same. But we actually think that many of the activities that fall under the security realm, such as checking an exit to make sure it's locked, watching a security camera, patrolling the hallways, are in some ways still distinct from formal law enforcement activities. Unfortunately, a lot of the research on SROs suggests that many of their impacts are not for the positive in schools. Obviously, the motivation for putting SROs in schools has a lot to do with school safety and preventing incidents like that occurred in Parkland and elsewhere. Understanding that from a research perspective is difficult. These incidents are so rare. And by these incidents, I mean these acts of mass school violence are so rare that it's hard to know whether SROs are having a deterring effect or whether they're responding in ways that prevent loss of life in these situations. Obviously, anecdotally, we see cases of both. Existence in Parkland of the SRO not responding in a way that most people perceived was effective, essentially staying outside of the school during the instance of shooting. Even going back to Columbine, many people aren't aware that there was a police officer in that school at the time. Though he engaged with the shooter, obviously a lot of casualties and a lot of loss of life occurred. So when we think about the impacts of SROs, there's both the aspect of safety, which is a little more difficult to evaluate from a research perspective, as well as the impacts that SROs are having on the school environment more broadly. And so when we think about SROs having kind of a day-to-day interaction with students, what this often means is that SROs get pulled into different activities, and particularly one being school discipline. And so a lot of the research on SRO's impact on school discipline suggests that SROs are likely to increase students' likelihood of experiencing exclusionary discipline. This means that SROs increase the likelihood that students will experience a suspension, an expulsion from school, as well as the likelihood that they may become involved in the criminal justice system through an act of arrest or other interaction with the SRO. There's some evidence that SROs can have an influence on the broader school climate, and this can translate then to outcomes of school discipline and other aspects of school culture. But when you bring a law enforcement officer into the school, even if that officer has some training in the school environment and with working with youth, that officer still tends to bring with him or her a propensity to think about issues through a law enforcement lens. And there's evidence that this has an influence on school leaders, teachers, in ways that make them shift what they see as their responsibility and the ways they approach things like school discipline to slightly more law enforcement or punitive approaches. So what this means is that we have concerns when we bring SROs into schools that we make sure that any benefit they may be adding in terms of safety is not being offset by potential negatives when it comes to their interaction with the school discipline system. It seems clear that SROs are going to continue for the near future to be a part of schools. And what I think this means from a research perspective and a practice perspective is that we need a strong emphasis on understanding the impacts they have across a broad spectrum of outcomes and providing evidence for practitioners and policymakers to make informed decisions about both the decision to put an SRO in the school as well as the implementation of SROs. There's mixed evidence on whether SROs increase safety and what impacts they may have on different other outcomes such as school discipline. What's important is when a school leader, such as a principal or a superintendent, makes that decision to bring the SRO into the school and then is working on a day-to-day basis with that SRO, that they're able to have the information they need to make informed choices and to situate the SRO's practice in a way that minimizes any harms for students. There are potential benefits of SROs in schools, and we want to make sure the research is able to contribute to maximizing those benefits while minimizing any potential harms.